I was staring at the ceiling in my bedroom at 3 in the morning and I couldn't move. My nightgown was torn. There was blood on my thighs. And Michael, my stepson, the man I'd called my boy for 30 years, was standing in my doorway zipping up his pants like nothing had happened. "Don't you dare tell anyone about this, Annie," he said to me. "Who's gonna believe an old woman anyway?" He walked out. Just walked out like he hadn't just destroyed everything I thought I knew about my life, about safety, about family. I was 81 years old and I was lying there trying to understand what had just happened to me in the house where I'd lived for 40 years. In the bed I'd shared with his father for half a century. My hands were shaking so bad I couldn't even pull the covers up. I kept thinking this had to be a nightmare. This had to be something my old mind had made up because grief does strange things to people, doesn't it? But the pain was real. The shame burning through my chest was real. The way my own stepson had just looked at me like I was nothing, like I was something he could just take because who was going to stop him, that was real too. I don't know how long I lay there before I realized the most terrifying truth of all. This wasn't the first time. My mind started putting pieces together that I'd been pushing away for months. The way he'd been touching my shoulder too long. The way he'd walk into the bathroom when I was in there. The things he'd say that made my skin crawl, but I told myself I was imagining things because surely this couldn't be happening. But it was happening. And it had been happening. And I was just now understanding that the person I trusted most in this world had been destroying me piece by piece. And I hadn't even seen it coming. But let me tell you how I got to that moment, because you need to understand who I was before all this happened. I wasn't always this broken old woman lying in a torn nightgown. I had a life. I had love. I had a family that I thought would protect me until the day I died. I met James Washington in 1960 when I was 25 years old. He was working at the lumber mill in town and I was teaching second grade at the elementary school. He had these gentle hands, calloused from work but soft when he touched my face. James had been married before and his wife had left him with a little boy named Michael who was only 7 years old when we met. That child had been through enough heartbreak already, so when James and I got married, I made a promise to myself that I would love Michael like he was my own flesh and blood. And I did love him. For 30 years I loved that boy. I packed his lunches for school, I sat up with him when he had nightmares, I taught him how to tie his shoes and ride a bicycle and treat people with kindness. When he scraped his knees, I cleaned the cuts and put bandages on them. When he brought home bad grades, I helped him with his homework at the kitchen table until he understood. When he graduated high school, I cried harder than his own mother ever did. James was the kind of man who never raised his voice, who said please and thank you to waitresses, who held doors open for strangers. He worked hard every day for 50 years to give us a good life in our little house on Maple Street. We never had much money, but we had each other. We had Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings and quiet evenings on the front porch watching the sun go down. Michael would come over for dinner every week, even after he got married and divorced and married again. He'd call me Mom and kiss my cheek when he left. That was my life. That was my family. James, Michael, and me in our little house where nothing bad was supposed to happen. If you can, please leave in the comments where you're watching this old lady from. It warms my heart to know that my voice is reaching far, maybe even places I never had the chance to visit. And if you like my story, please leave a like and subscribe to Grandparents Archives. James died on a Tuesday morning in March of 2010. He was 75 years old and he was drinking his coffee at the kitchen table like he had every morning for 20 years when his heart just stopped. I found him there when I came back from my doctor's appointment. His coffee was still warm. I was 68 years old and I had never lived alone in my entire life. I went from my father's house to James's house. And suddenly I was rattling around in all those empty rooms by myself. The silence was the worst part. James used to hum while he shaved in the mornings and he'd talk to the television during the evening news. Without those sounds, the house felt like a tomb. I couldn't sleep in our bed anymore. I couldn't cook for just one person. I'd catch myself setting 2 plates on the table for dinner and then remember. Everything reminded me of him. His reading glasses on the nightstand. His coffee mug still in the sink because I couldn't bring myself to wash it. His clothes hanging in the closet still smelling like his aftershave. Michael started coming by every day after the funeral. He'd check on me, bring me groceries, fix little things around the house that were falling apart. I was grateful for his help because I didn't know how to take care of a house by myself. James had always handled the repairs, the bills, the practical things. I felt helpless and lost, like a child who'd been left alone in the dark. "Don't worry about anything, Mom," Michael told me. "I'm going to take care of you just like Dad would have wanted. You don't have to be alone." When he suggested moving in with me, it seemed like the answer to everything. I wouldn't be alone anymore. The house wouldn't feel so empty. And Michael could save money on rent while helping me with things I couldn't manage on my own. It felt like the natural thing to do, like family taking care of family the way it was supposed to be. I trusted him completely. He was my son, the boy I'd raised, James's boy. Of course I trusted him. Michael moved in 3 months after James died. At first, it was exactly what I needed. He'd make me breakfast in the mornings and we'd sit at the kitchen table talking about his father, sharing stories, keeping James's memory alive. He fixed the leaky faucet in the bathroom and replaced the burnt-out bulbs I couldn't reach. He even helped me sort through James's clothes, which I'd been putting off because it hurt too much to do alone. But somewhere around the 6-month mark, things started changing in ways I couldn't quite put my finger on. Michael had always enjoyed a beer or two, but now he was drinking every night. Not just 1 or 2 beers, but enough that his words would get thick and his eyes would get that glassy look. When I'd mention it, he'd get defensive. "I'm dealing with grief too, Annie. Dad was my father." He started staying out later, coming home at all hours, and I'd hear him stumbling around the house in the dark. Sometimes he'd have friends over, loud men who'd sit on my front porch drinking and talking until midnight. When I asked him to keep it down because the neighbors might complain, he'd get this look on his face like I'd insulted him. "This is my house too now," he'd say. "I live here. I pay bills here." Which wasn't exactly true. Michael helped with groceries sometimes, but I was still paying the mortgage, the utilities, everything else. But I didn't want to argue. I told myself he was hurting, that losing James had been hard on him too, that men grieve differently than women do. Then he started going through my mail. I'd come home from the grocery store and find my letters opened, my bills spread out on the kitchen counter. When I asked him about it, he said he was just trying to help me stay organized, make sure I wasn't missing any payments. But it made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't explain. He took my car keys one day, said my reflexes weren't what they used to be and it wasn't safe for me to drive anymore. When I protested, he showed me a small dent on the bumper that I didn't remember making, and suddenly I doubted myself. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was getting too old to drive safely. My phone went missing for 3 days. Michael said he'd found it in the couch cushions, but I knew I hadn't left it there. When I got it back, some of my contacts were deleted. My friend Sarah's number was gone. My doctor's office. My nephew in Atlanta. "You must have done it by accident," Michael said. "These smartphones are confusing for people your age." I started feeling like I was losing my mind. Small things would disappear and reappear in different places. My reading glasses. My house keys. The spare money I kept in the kitchen drawer for emergencies. When I'd ask Michael about these things, he'd look at me with this expression of concern, like he was worried about my memory, my mental state. And maybe that's exactly what he wanted me to think. The first time it happened was in November of 2011, about a year and a half after James died. Michael had been out drinking with his friends and he came home around 2 in the morning. I heard him stumbling around downstairs, knocking into furniture, cursing under his breath. I stayed in my bedroom with the door closed, pretending to be asleep, hoping he'd just go to his room and pass out like he usually did. But then I heard his footsteps on the stairs, slow and deliberate. My bedroom door opened and there he was, standing in the doorway with the hallway light behind him. I could smell the alcohol on him from across the room. "Michael," I said, "are you all right?" He didn't answer. He just stood there for what felt like forever, and then he started walking toward my bed. I sat up, confused, thinking maybe he was sick or needed help with something. But when he got close to me, I could see his face in the dim light from the street lamp outside my window. His eyes looked different. Like he was looking at something he wanted to take. What happened next, I still have trouble saying out loud. My own stepson, the boy I'd raised, the man who called me Mom, he hurt me in ways I never thought were possible. I was 69 years old, and I didn't understand what was happening until it was too late to stop it. I tried to push him away, but he was so much stronger than me. I tried to scream, but he put his hand over my mouth and told me to shut up. When it was over, he stood up and looked down at me like I was something dirty he'd stepped in. "If you tell anyone about this, Annie, they'll think you're crazy. Who's going to believe that a grandmother made up a story like this for attention?" Then he left. Just walked out of my room like nothing had happened, and I heard his bedroom door close down the hall. I laid there for hours, shaking, trying to convince myself it had been a nightmare. But my body knew better. I hurt in places I'd never hurt before. My nightgown was torn. There were bruises on my arms where he'd held me down. I couldn't tell anyone. Who would I tell? My neighbor Sarah was a sweet woman, but we'd never talked about anything more serious than the weather or what was on sale at the grocery store. My nephew in Atlanta only called on holidays. And Michael was right about one thing. Who was going to believe me? A 69-year-old woman accusing her stepson of something so horrible? I convinced myself it was a one-time thing. Michael had been drinking heavily, he was still grieving his father, he wasn't thinking clearly. Surely it would never happen again. I just had to be more careful, lock my bedroom door, make sure I stayed out of his way when he'd been drinking. But deep down I think I knew it wasn't over. The way he looked at me the next morning over breakfast, like he was testing me to see if I'd say anything. The way he smiled when I kept my eyes down and didn't mention what had happened. He knew he could get away with it. And that scared me more than anything. It didn't stop. Over the next 2 years, it happened again and again. Sometimes weeks would go by and I'd think maybe it was finally over. Maybe Michael had come to his senses. But then he'd drink too much, or he'd have a bad day at work. Or sometimes there wouldn't be any reason at all. He'd just decide he wanted something from me and he'd take it. I started locking my bedroom door, but Michael had keys to everything in the house. I tried staying awake all night when I knew he'd been drinking, but I was 70 years old and I couldn't fight off sleep forever. I thought about going to stay with my nephew in Atlanta, but Michael had convinced me to cancel my credit cards because he said seniors get targeted by identity thieves. I had no money of my own, no way to buy a bus ticket, no way to leave. The worst part wasn't even what he did to me. The worst part was how he acted the next day, like nothing had happened. He'd make me coffee and ask if I needed anything from the store. He'd fix something around the house or bring me flowers from the grocery store. Once he even apologized. "I'm sorry about last night, Mom," he said, not looking me in the eye. "I was drunk and I wasn't thinking straight. It won't happen again." But it always happened again. My neighbor Sarah started noticing changes in me. She'd stop by to chat like she always had, but now I'd make excuses to cut our visits short. I couldn't concentrate on our conversations. I'd forget what she was saying in the middle of her sentences. I stopped going to church, stopped working in my garden, stopped doing most of the things that used to bring me joy. "Annie, are you feeling all right?" Sarah asked me one afternoon when she found me crying on my front porch. "You seem different lately. Sadder." I wanted to tell her everything. The words were right there in my throat, begging to come out. But what would I say? That my stepson was raping me? That the man who helped me carry my groceries and fixed my leaky roof was the same man who hurt me in my own bed? Sarah knew Michael. She thought he was wonderful, always complimenting him on what a good son he was, how lucky I was to have someone taking such good care of me. "I'm just missing James," I told her. "Some days are harder than others." She patted my hand and said she understood that grief takes time. If only she knew what I was really grieving. I was mourning the death of my sense of safety, my trust in family, my belief that home was supposed to be the one place where you were protected from the world's cruelty. I started wearing long sleeves even in summer to hide the bruises on my arms. I learned to move carefully, to always be aware of where Michael was in the house, to read his moods and try to stay out of his way when he seemed angry or restless. I became a prisoner in my own home, walking on eggshells, jumping at every sound. The shame was eating me alive. I felt dirty all the time, like everyone could see what was happening to me just by looking at my face. I stopped looking at myself in mirrors. I stopped caring about my appearance, my health, my future. What was the point? This was my life now, and it was never going to change. Michael had all the power, and he knew it. By the summer of 2013, I had stopped eating regular meals. Food had no taste anymore, and my stomach was always tied up in knots anyway. I'd lost so much weight that my clothes hung off me like I was a scarecrow. Michael would comment on it sometimes, pretending to be concerned. "You need to take better care of yourself, Mom," he'd say. Dad wouldn't want you wasting away like this. The mention of James always cut deep because Michael knew exactly what he was doing. He was using my dead husband's memory as a weapon against me, reminding me that James wasn't there to protect me anymore, that Michael was all I had left. I stopped praying. I'd been going to the same church for 40 years, but I couldn't sit in those pews anymore listening to sermons about God's love and protection when I felt so abandoned. Where was God when Michael was hurting me? Where was the divine intervention I'd been taught to believe in my whole life? I felt like my faith had been just another lie I'd told myself to feel safe in a world that wasn't safe at all. Some nights, I would lie in bed after Michael had finished with me, and I would think about how easy it would be to just not wake up in the morning. I had a bottle of sleeping pills in my medicine cabinet that my doctor had prescribed after James died. I would count them in my head, wondering if there were enough, wondering if anyone would really miss me or if they'd just think I died of old age and loneliness. The only thing that stopped me was the thought that people would find my body and know what had been done to me. The idea of Sarah or my nephew or the paramedics seeing evidence of my shame was worse than the thought of continuing to live with it. Even in death, I was worried about protecting Michael's secret, about not causing a scandal that would hurt the family name. That's how broken I had become. I was more concerned about embarrassing my abuser than I was about saving my own life. It was on a Thursday afternoon in August when everything changed. I was cleaning out James's old desk, something I'd been putting off for 3 years because it felt too final, like I was erasing the last pieces of him from the house. But I was running out of places to hide from Michael during the day, and going through James's things seemed like a task that might keep my mind occupied. In the bottom drawer, underneath some old tax documents and warranties for appliances we didn't even own anymore, I found a shoebox full of letters. Letters I had written to James when we were dating, love notes I'd left in his lunchbox over the years, birthday cards from our children and grandchildren. But at the bottom of the box was an envelope I didn't recognize, addressed to me in James's handwriting. My hands were shaking as I opened it. Inside was a letter dated just 2 weeks before James died, like he'd had some kind of premonition that his time was running short. "My dearest Annie," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you're going through my things, probably crying and missing me something awful. I want you to know that loving you has been the greatest joy of my life. You made me a better man, a better father, a better human being just by being yourself." I had to stop reading because I was crying so hard I couldn't see the words anymore. But I forced myself to continue. "I know you're going to be scared without me. You've never lived alone and you're going to think you can't take care of yourself. But Annie, you are the strongest person I've ever known. You raised my boy when his own mother couldn't be bothered. You built a home that was filled with love and laughter. You survived losing your parents, your sister, your first miscarriage, and you came through all of it with your heart still open, still ready to love and be loved." The letter went on for 2 more pages, but it was that one line that broke something open inside me. "You are the strongest person I've ever known." I read those words over and over again until I had them memorized. James had seen strength in me that I had forgotten existed. He had believed in my ability to survive anything, even things he couldn't have imagined when he wrote that letter. For the first time in 3 years, I felt angry instead of just afraid. I was angry at Michael for what he'd done to me, but I was even angrier at myself for letting him convince me that I was powerless. I was angry that I had been ready to give up, to let him win, to die without ever fighting back. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my pocket. That night, when Michael came home drunk and headed toward my room, I didn't pretend to be asleep. I sat up in my bed and looked him straight in the eye. "No," I said. Just that one word, but I said it like I meant it. He laughed. "What did you say to me, old woman?" I said, "No. You're not going to touch me anymore." Michael's face changed, and for a moment I thought he was going to hit me. But something in my voice, or maybe something in my posture, made him stop. I wasn't cowering anymore. I wasn't apologizing for taking up space in my own house. He stood there for a long moment and then he turned around and walked out of my room. I heard him slam his bedroom door so hard the whole house shook. I didn't sleep that night, but not because I was afraid. I stayed awake making plans. I was going to get out of this house. I was going to tell someone what had been happening to me. I was going to honor the strength that James had seen in me, the strength I was finally ready to find again. I was 71 years old and I was done being a victim. The next morning, I waited until Michael left for work, and then I walked to the drugstore and bought a composition notebook with my grocery money. I came home and sat at my kitchen table, the same table where James used to drink his coffee, and I started writing down everything I could remember. Every date, every detail, every time Michael had hurt me over the past 3 years. My handwriting was shaky because my arthritis was acting up, but I forced myself to keep going. I wrote for hours. I documented the bruises, the threats, the way he'd isolated me from my friends and family. I wrote about how he'd taken my car keys and my phone, how he'd made me doubt my own memory, how he'd used James's death and my grief as weapons against me. Reading it all back, seeing it laid out on paper in black and white, I realized just how calculated it had all been. This wasn't a grieving stepson who'd made some terrible mistakes. This was a predator who'd been planning this from the moment he moved into my house. But writing it down was the easy part. Actually telling someone was going to be the hardest thing I'd ever done in my life. I knew it had to be Sarah. She was the only person who still came around, the only one who might notice if something happened to me. But how do you tell your neighbor, a woman you've talked to about flower gardens and grocery store sales, that you've been living a nightmare for 3 years? I practiced what I was going to say for 2 weeks. I'd stand in front of my bathroom mirror and try to get the words out, but they'd stick in my throat every time. I was terrified that Sarah wouldn't believe me, that she'd think I was having some kind of mental breakdown, that she'd tell other people in the neighborhood that poor old Annie Washington had lost her mind. Finally, on a Tuesday afternoon in September, I saw Sarah working in her front yard and I knew it was time. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely walk across the street, but I forced myself to put one foot in front of the other. "Sarah," I said, "I need to talk to you about something important. Something that's been happening in my house." She must have heard something in my voice, because she dropped her gardening tools and gave me her full attention. We sat on her front porch and I pulled out my notebook and started reading. I couldn't look at her face while I talked. I just stared down at my own handwriting and told her everything. When I finished, there was a long silence. I was sure she was going to tell me I was confused, that I'd misunderstood what had happened, that Michael would never do something like that. But when I finally looked up, Sarah had tears running down her cheeks. "Oh, Annie," she said. "Oh, honey. I'm so sorry. I should have seen the signs. I should have known something was wrong." He believed me. After 3 years of carrying this secret alone, someone finally believed me. Sarah didn't waste any time. She called her daughter who worked at the women's shelter in the next county. And within an hour I was talking to a counselor named Patricia who specialized in elder abuse. Patricia explained that what had happened to me wasn't uncommon, that family members were actually the most likely perpetrators of abuse against elderly people, especially elderly women living alone. "You're not crazy, Annie," Patricia told me over the phone. "You're not making this up and you're not responsible for what happened to you. But you are responsible for what happens next and you have choices to make." The hardest choice was whether to report Michael to the police. Patricia explained that pressing charges would mean going through the legal system, telling my story to strangers, having my private life examined in court. But she also explained that if I didn't report him, he would probably do this to someone else. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about other women, other elderly women who might be trusting Michael the way I had trusted him. I thought about my responsibility to protect them, even if it meant sacrificing my own privacy and dignity. 3 days later, I walked into the police station with Sarah by my side and filed a report. Detective Williams was the officer assigned to my case, and I could tell he was skeptical at first. He kept asking me the same questions over and over, like he was trying to catch me in a lie. But when I showed him my notebook with all the dates and details written in my own handwriting, his attitude changed. "Mrs. Washington," he said, "I want you to know that we take these allegations very seriously. We're going to investigate this thoroughly." They arrested Michael at his job 2 days later. I wasn't there to see it, but Sarah told me later that it was all over the local news. "Local man charged with elder abuse," the headline read. I felt sick reading it, seeing our family's private shame spread across the newspaper for everyone to see. But I also felt something else. Relief. The secret was finally out. What happened next surprised everyone, including me. 3 days after Michael's arrest, The police got a phone call from a woman named Lisa Carter. She said she'd seen the news story and wanted to talk to them about Michael Turner. Lisa had been Michael's girlfriend 5 years earlier, before James died, and she said he'd done the same things to her. She'd never reported it because she thought no one would believe her, because Michael was so charming and well-liked in the community. Then another woman came forward. And another. By the end of the week, 4 different women had contacted the police with stories about Michael. The youngest was 45, the oldest was 78. All of them had been afraid to speak up. All of them had been convinced they were the only ones. Suddenly, my case wasn't about one confused old woman making accusations against her stepson. It was about a pattern of behavior, a man who had been preying on vulnerable women for years. Detective Williams called me personally to tell me about the other victims. "Mrs. Washington," he said, "you showing up at this police station may have saved other women from going through what you went through. You should be proud of your courage." Courage. I'd never thought of myself as courageous. But maybe that's what courage really was, not the absence of fear but doing what needed to be done despite the fear. For the first time in 3 years I felt like myself again. I felt like the woman James had fallen in love with, the woman he'd believed was strong enough to survive anything. I was still scared about what was coming next, but I wasn't alone anymore. And Michael couldn't hurt me ever again. The trial took 8 months to get to court, and those were some of the longest months of my life. Michael's lawyer tried everything he could think of to discredit me and the other women who came forward. He suggested we were all mentally unstable, that we'd confused dreams with reality, that we were seeking attention or money. He painted Michael as a grieving son who'd been trying to care for his elderly stepmother, only to be rewarded with false accusations. But Detective Williams and the prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Jennifer Hayes, had done their homework. They had my notebook with all the dates and details. They had medical records showing injuries I'd sustained that were consistent with assault. They had testimony from Sarah about the changes she'd noticed in my behavior. Most importantly, they had testimony from all 4 women who'd come forward, and our stories matched in ways that couldn't be explained by coincidence. I had to testify for 3 hours on a Wednesday morning in March of 2014. Walking into that courtroom was one of the scariest things I'd ever done. There were reporters there, strangers in the gallery, and Michael sitting at the defendant's table in a suit and tie, looking like the respectable businessman he'd always pretended to be. When I took the witness stand, I looked out at all those faces staring at me, and for a moment I felt that old familiar shame trying to creep back in. But then I saw Sarah sitting in the front row, nodding at me encouragingly. I saw the other victims who'd come forward, women who were there to support me just like I was there to support them. And somehow I felt James with me too. Not in a supernatural way, but in the strength he'd always believed I possessed, the strength I'd finally learned to access. I told my story clearly and calmly. I didn't break down or get emotional. I just stated the facts as they had happened, looking directly at the jury when I spoke. When Michael's lawyer tried to suggest that I was confused about what had occurred, I said, "Sir, I may be 72 years old, but there's nothing wrong with my memory. I remember every detail of what your client did to me." The hardest part was when they played the recording of Michael's confession. After his arrest, Detective Williams had convinced him to take a polygraph test, and during the questioning, Michael had admitted to sexual contact with me. He claimed it was consensual, that I'd initiated it because I was lonely and grieving. The lies that came out of his mouth on that recording made me sick to my stomach. But they also proved that he couldn't deny what had happened anymore. When the jury came back with a guilty verdict on all counts, I felt something I hadn't felt in 4 years. I felt vindicated. Michael was sentenced to 15 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 10. The judge, an older woman named Margaret Crawford, looked directly at me when she delivered the sentence. "Mrs. Washington," she said, "your courage in coming forward has undoubtedly prevented other women from becoming victims. This court wants you to know that justice has been served today." But the legal victory was only the beginning of my healing process. Patricia from the women's shelter had connected me with a support group for elderly abuse survivors, led by a therapist named Emma Johnson. Emma was about 50 years old, with kind eyes and a gentle voice, and she specialized in helping older women rebuild their lives after trauma. The first time I walked into that support group meeting, I was terrified. There were 6 other women there, ranging in age from 65 to 82, and they all had stories similar to mine. Stories of family members who'd betrayed their trust, of feeling isolated and helpless, of thinking they were too old for anyone to care about their suffering. "Annie," Emma said during my first meeting, "trauma doesn't have an expiration date. It doesn't matter if you're 25 or 75, what happened to you was wrong, and you deserve to heal from it." Over the next year, I learned things about myself that I'd never known. I learned that I'd been carrying shame that wasn't mine to carry. I learned that healing isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't affect you. It's about reclaiming your power and refusing to let your trauma define your future. The other women in the group became like family to me. We met every Thursday afternoon in the conference room at the community center, and we talked about everything, not just the bad things that had happened to us, but the good things we were rediscovering about ourselves. Margaret, who was 78, had started taking painting classes after her nephew was convicted of financial abuse. Dorothy, who was 82, had reconnected with old friends she'd lost touch with when her son isolated her from them. Emma taught us practical things too. How to recognize the warning signs of manipulation. How to set boundaries with family members. How to trust our own instincts when something felt wrong. She helped me understand that what Michael had done to me was about power and control, not about sex or desire. He'd targeted me because I was vulnerable, isolated, and trusting, not because there was something wrong with me. "You survived," Emma would remind us every week. "You're not just victims. You're survivors. And survivors have wisdom that can help other people." That's when I started thinking about telling my story more publicly. Emma encouraged me to consider speaking to other groups, sharing my experience with people who might be going through something similar. The idea scared me at first, but I realized that staying silent hadn't protected me, it had only protected Michael. A year after the trial ended, I gave my first public speech at a conference for healthcare workers who deal with elderly patients. Standing at that podium, looking out at a room full of nurses and social workers and doctors, I felt nervous but also purposeful. These were people who were in positions to help other women like me, and maybe my story could teach them something useful. "My name is Annie Washington," I began, "and I'm 73 years old. I want to tell you about something that happened to me, not because I enjoy talking about it, but because someone in this room might encounter a situation like mine, and you need to know what to look for." After my speech, 3 different healthcare workers came up to me and said they'd encountered patients with similar stories, but they hadn't known how to help them. One nurse said she'd been suspicious about an elderly patient's injuries but hadn't felt comfortable asking direct questions about family members. That's when I knew I'd found my purpose. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was an advocate. I was using my experience to help other people, just like Emma had suggested. And for the first time since James died, I felt like my life had meaning again. I'm 83 years old now, and I've learned that age doesn't make your voice matter any less. For too long, I believed that because I was old, what happened to me didn't count as much as if it had happened to someone younger. I thought I should just accept whatever life threw at me and be grateful for any help I got, even if it came with a terrible price. That's exactly what Michael counted on. He knew that society sees elderly women as disposable, that we're past the point where anyone cares what happens to us. He thought I'd be too ashamed to speak up, too afraid of not being believed. But here's what I know now. Your voice matters no matter how old you are. Your right to safety and dignity doesn't expire when you hit a certain birthday. And there are people who will believe you and fight for you, even when you don't think you have the strength to fight for yourself. I moved out of that house on Maple Street 2 years ago. Too many bad memories lived in those walls. I have a little apartment now near the community center where my support group meets. It's small, but it's mine. I garden again, I spend time with my grandchildren, and I speak at conferences to help other people recognize the signs of elder abuse. Every time I tell my story, someone comes up to me afterward and says they know someone who needs help, or they thank me for giving them courage to speak up about their own situation. That's when I know that surviving wasn't enough. I had to turn my pain into purpose. If you're watching this because something similar is happening to you, please know that you matter. Your safety matters. Your voice matters. If you're being hurt by someone you trust, tell someone. Tell a neighbor, tell a doctor, call the police, call the elder abuse hotline. I know you're scared, I know you think no one will believe you, but I thought those same things and I was wrong. You are not too old to deserve safety. You are not responsible for what someone else chooses to do to you. And you are not powerless even when everything tells you that you are. I'm so grateful you've listened to my story this far. It's not always easy revisiting these memories, but knowing that sharing them might help someone else find their way makes it completely worthwhile. I truly hope that what I've shared today isn't just a sad tale, but also a source of motivation. It's a reminder that no matter how difficult life becomes, there's always light at the end of the road. Always remember that strength lies within you, and hope is a flame that should never be put out. To help us keep spreading these meaningful stories, please support the Grandparents Archives channel by subscribing, liking this video, and sharing it with your loved ones. I want to sincerely thank the founder of Grandparents Archives for giving me this opportunity to share my experience. Stay tuned for more touching stories on the Grandparents Archives channel.